Okay, today is the fourth lecture of part two of the life and thought of Moses Maimonides. It's January 7th, 2014 already. 8th. January 8th.
Time flies.
Yeah, sorry for the mistake on the material. Happy New Year to all of you.
Today's the 8th.
Yeah, today's the 8th. Okay, just a reminder, we won't be meeting next week because next week is Tu B'Shvat and I've got a lecture in Columbus, Ohio I'm going to. So we'll be meeting in 2 weeks. What we're going to do today is skip forward in the source book to the laws of gifts for the poor, which is in the Sefer Zra'im, the book of seeds, which because it deals with agricultural laws, where Maimonides puts this particular treatise on what we would call tzedakah. So I want to begin, and here, if you want to have a copy of the Tanakh to take a look at the texts, you can. You don't, I'm going to just talk about them briefly. I want to talk a little bit about tzedakah. So there is no concept of what we call tzedakah in the Torah. That's for a couple of reasons. First of all, the term itself, in the way we understand it, doesn't exist. The root, obviously, tzedek, is used a lot, and even the noun tzedakah is used, but not in the sense we understand it. It's understood in the sense of justice, equity, righteousness, and so on. And of course, when you're looking at the law codes of the Torah, with a little bit of exception in the book of Deuteronomy, you're really not talking about a society that has what we call cash. In other words, it's the people are agriculturalists, and therefore product and payment is primarily in agricultural goods. There was silver, weights of silver as a means of exchange, but there was no coinage of it. Deuteronomy, a little later, you begin to see a little bit more of the use of silver as a kind of a monetary exchange. But again, everything's primarily agricultural. So what you find in the Torah, primarily in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, are a series of laws which are part of larger structure of laws. The larger structure are laws protecting the powerless. Classically, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien who's not a citizen, therefore doesn't own land, but also the poor. And so there's a whole series of laws, actually starting with Exodus, but in all of the law codes in Leviticus, and especially in Deuteronomy, that are protecting the poor from undue oppression and exploitation, and attempting to help, especially in Deuteronomy, the issue of what happens if they fall into debt. And what you have in Leviticus especially are a series of tithes. There's a tithing system in the Torah, and it has several functions. It's meant to support the sanctuary. It's meant to support the priesthood. In Deuteronomy, there's a special tithe which is meant to support the centrality of Jerusalem, whereby it's called the secondary tithe, Maaser Sheni, where after the first tithe, in the 7-year cycle, there's a certain number of years where you take the second 10% of your produce and you turn it into some kind of silver, you sell it, and then you take that silver and you go to Jerusalem and you spend it there. Okay? In some of those years, that second tithe is given to the poor, okay, rather than taken to Jerusalem. I mean, it doesn't say Jerusalem, but that's obviously what's meant. There's also in Leviticus a series of tithes regarding harvesting of crops. And these are referred to as Peah, Leket, Shechicha, and Oholot. I already mentioned the poor tithe. So there are 4 others. Peah is the corners of the fields that you're supposed to leave. Leket are things that drop from the harvesters that the poor can come behind and glean. Shechicha are things that are forgotten in the fields, and oholot are part of sort of similar to the others, but dealing with vineyards, okay, grape harvests. And this was a way to help the poor in the most important way in which they need to be helped, namely food. Okay? So what you find in rabbinic literature is a transformation. In other words, these things don't go away because still most people are involved in agriculture, but you begin to see more of what we would call a moneyed economy during the period of the Roman Empire, especially. And what you see is the rabbis develop what we would call the classic rules of tzedakah. That's really where it shows up.
Where is that?
In rabbinic literature, like in the Talmud, Mishnah and the Talmud especially, okay, where it is discussed. Now, the tithing system is still important to them, by the way. It's extremely important to them, and that comes from the Pharisees to the point where food that is not properly tithed is treated almost as if it's non-kosher food, even though it has nothing to do with meat. In other words, the Pharisees, one of the reasons why they only ate at each other's tables is they suspected that people who were not part of their group might not keep kashrut in the classic sense as strictly as they did, but secondly, that they would serve food, crop food, that wasn't properly tithed. And there's a tractate in the Mishnah, as a matter of fact, about what to do with food that is suspected of being improperly tithed, but you don't know for sure. So that carries on in rabbinic literature, but what becomes increasingly important, especially in the Babylonian Talmud, is how to support the poor using what we would call classical tzedakah, meaning money. The reason why is because the tithing laws were not seen to have any effect or needed to be followed outside the land of Israel. It only referred to crops in the land of Israel. And even today, by the way, if you go to the markets in Israel, you will often see signs above vegetable sellers that their food had been properly tithed. Now, perfectly honest with you, I have no idea what happens to that tithed food, but nonetheless, there are still people who are concerned about that, even to the point where some Orthodox people here in this country will examine products made in Israel to see whether it's certified that they have been tithed, namely fruits and vegetable products and things of that sort. Yes?
Tithing, as far as I understood, was a Latin word.
Yeah, but
What's the word that we should be using?
maaser, which means a tenth, taking a tenth. Okay? So it's referred to as there's the maaser rishon, there is the maaser sheni, there's also another tithe which isn't a 10%, that comes right off the top called truma, which goes to a priest, and there's not a specific amount designated. Again, there's a whole system there, but what happens is that the rabbis turn the rules of tzedakah into an official scriptural Torah-itic mitzvah. So what you will see, and I've given you a lot that's not in our book, because what you have in our book is the thing that is most well known about Maimonides and tzedakah, which is his 8 grades of tzedakah. But I really wanted to give you some of the other material to show you how he presents I didn't give you all of it, obviously, how he presents the classical rabbinic material, how there are bits in it that reflect his own day and his own community. At the end, I've actually given you material about his particular community during the time that he lived. Because I will tell you that throughout the Middle Ages, Jewish communities in both Christian countries and Islamic countries maintain extensive social agencies, we would call them, for the protection of the poor and for the collection and distribution of tzedakah. In Europe, the community had a lot more coercive power than they did in Islamic countries, but there was a great deal of social stigma and power related to it. We'll get to that material eventually, but I wanted to show you some of his classic material first of all. So,
But the tithing, where you start, the tithing related only to crops within the land of Israel.
yes, that's the whole point. It was for farmers in the land of Israel, and therefore, when you get to the Babylonian Talmud, you don't have any Gemara on those tractates in the Mishnah that deal with tithing, whereas in the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud Gemara, you do have Gemara on those tractates because it was still relevant to them. But it was irrelevant to the Babylonian rabbis because it just had no import in their, no effect in outside the land of Israel. You'll see something very interesting that
Why
Maimonides...
didn't they just transplant it?
Because they said it was specifically about the land. Remember, the land has a special category. The land of Israel is a special category within Jewish law that is different. There are laws that only apply there and not outside the land of Israel. And tithing is one of them. But Maimonides, interestingly enough, exhibits an opinion that is a little against that, which, by the way, later authorities disagree on, and the general practice to this day is that produce produced outside the land of Israel is not required to be tithed. But look at what he says. This is on the first page of the material I gave you. So this is from chapter 1 of his tractate. What he calls them gifts to the poor. That's the title of the tractate officially. So take a look at the this first one. Cal, you want to read it according to scriptural law?
According to scriptural law, all of these presents for the poor must be given only in Eretz Yisrael, like terumah and the tithes, as indicated by Leviticus 19:9. When you reap the harvest of your land, and Deuteronomy 24:19, when you reap your harvest in your field. It has already been explained in the Talmud that the mitzvah of pe'ah must be observed in the diaspora according to rabbinic decree. It appears to me that this law applies to all the remainder of these presents to the poor. All of their obligations must be observed in the diaspora according to rabbinic decree.
And again, here he's completely against the drift of Jewish law, the rest of the Jewish tradition. He's claiming that these laws apply outside the land of Israel. But that just never happened. Okay? It really didn't. Notice he says it's a Torah law that it applies in the land of Israel, but it's a rabbinic decree, it's rabbinic law, midrabanan, that it should apply outside the land of Israel. But this decision was not accepted by later authorities, and you will not see it, for example, in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay? So, as I said, specifically tzedakah is not found in the Torah, but nonetheless, the rabbis connected up to some very specific scriptural verses. In other words, they make it a Torah law by interpretation. And here, and the two are Leviticus 25, chapter 25, verses 35 to 36, and Deuteronomy 15, 5 to 11. And if you want to take a look at those, if you have a Tanakh in front of you, it's kind of worth taking a quick look at. So if you go to Leviticus 25,
265.
265?
265. Yes,
Please, no, it's
265 verse 5. Okay. Here, 265, chapter 25 verse 35 is in fact on 267. You see the phrase here, if your kinsman, being in straits, comes under your authority, and you hold him as though a resident alien, let him live by your side. Do not exact from him an advance or accrued interest, but fear the Lord your God. Let him live by your side as your kinsman. Now, the law in the context of it is about charging interest on loans. But that phrase, live by his side, is taken to be give him tzedakah. Okay? And if you take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 5, found on page 408, you will see it talks about the needy, and especially if you take a look at verse 7, do not harden your heart and shut your hand, literally, close up your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him for whatever he needs. Okay? So, in other words, again, this is really about, the chapter 15 is about the remission of debts in the 7th year. It's really all about loans and debts, but the rabbis pull out these particular verses to be the basis for tzedakah. And here's where we're going to go to chapter 7. You see, the first 7 chapters of this treatise deal completely with the tithing system, all the details of it in very close detail. Okay? Chapter 7 is where we begin to see him deal with the laws of tzedakah. So, Cal, do you want to continue with chapter 7, halacha 1?
Both of the biblical citations
Yeah.
are to kinsmen.
Yes.
Is that to take the whole people of Israel as your kin? Or?
Yes, all the Jews as your kin. But as you will see, through a rabbinic decree, that can be expanded to non-Jews as well who live in your community. But there's some very interesting material on that issue, right? What do you do if you get a donation from a non-Jew to your charity? The issue is if he's an idolater or not, right? That's the big issue. And what you're going to see here is Maimonides has encapsulated all of the rabbinic discussion found in the Talmuds into these paragraphs. So, Cal, read on. It is a positive commandment.
It is a positive commandment to give charity to the poor among the Jewish people, according to what is appropriate for the poor person, if this is within the financial capacity of the donor. As Deuteronomy 15:5 says, you shall certainly open your hand to him. Leviticus 25:35 states, you shall support him, a stranger and a resident, and they shall live with you. And 36 states, and your brother shall live with you.
So there it is. So he is reflecting the rabbinic idea that these are the verses that make this a Torah law, not just a rabbinic law or an interpretation, but specifically one of the 613 mitzvot as counted by rabbinic authorities. Read on.
Anyone who sees a poor person asking and turns his eyes away from him and does not give him charity transgresses a negative commandment. As Deuteronomy 15:7 states, do not harden your heart or close your hand against your brother, the poor person.
So not only is it a positive commandment, a positive mitzvah to give tzedakah, by not doing it, you're breaking a negative commandment. Okay? And that's really important. That shows you how important this is. Read the next one.
We are commanded to give a poor person according to what he lacks. If he lacks clothes, we should clothe him. If he lacks household utensils, we should purchase them for him. If he is unmarried, we should help him marry. And for an unmarried woman, we shall find a husband for her. Even if the personal habit of this poor person was to ride on a horse and to have a servant run before him, and then he became impoverished and lost his wealth, we should buy a horse for him to ride and a servant to run before him. This is implied by Deuteronomy 15:8, which speaks of providing him with enough to fill the lack that he feels. You are commanded to fill his lack, but you are not obliged. You are not obliged to enrich him.
Now, this is a very interesting feature of rabbinic law on tzedakah, is that, and one wonders how much this actually was practiced.
I'm guessing it wasn't.
I don't know, but to me it's something that comes right out of the Talmud, that a person of means who has fallen on bad times should be supported close to the means in which he's used to. Now, why do you think the rabbis did that?
Because of the humiliation.
Exactly. that is one of the central features of rabbinic laws about tzedakah, is that the poor person should never be humiliated or shown disrespect. So that's really what's at the heart of all of this.
This is in the Talmud? Oh, no, it's not.
It all comes.
It's in
It's
Deuteronomy also.
well, he's quoting Deuteronomy as a scriptural basis for it. It's not really in Deuteronomy in a plain sense of the term, but this is what how the rabbis understood this to mean. That first of all, it's interesting that it is notice lacks clothes, household utensils, marriage. In other words, it's not just a matter of give him some money and send him on his way. And by the way, you will see that when we get to the communal structures in Maimonides' own community in his own day, they really did make an attempt to try and provide, not, again, I don't know about this last part, but the first part about providing them with their various needs was something that was done. Because it wasn't just hand them money. Okay, yeah, Irma.
This business about fill the lack but not enrich the person, not go beyond that.
Right.
Are there any lawyers in here?
Yes.
Yeah? Who? Oh, isn't it? Okay. Because I remember when I was going through a divorce, one of the attorneys said, well, you can't expect to get money in this sense because you didn't spend that much during the marriage. You never sent those kids to camp. Therefore, you can only ask, you're limited into what you can
What you're
ask.
accustomed to.
Yeah, you can only get what you're accustomed to, the lack. You can't be enriched by it. Is that true that, the
I have
pen?
no idea.
Okay, real estate law, what kind of law are you? No, but this whole thing about, well, why didn't you send your kids to summer camp? Then you could. And I said, well, it was that idea of not going beyond what you were accustomed to spending.
That's a very interesting point, actually.
And I'd always been a saver and, very frugal, and that was my downfall.
And you got penalized. You got penalized for that.
And for other things. But
All right, let's move on to the next one.
right.
Sam, you want to do number? You sure you want that recorded? Sam, you want to move on to number 5 when a poor person comes.
And when a poor person comes and asks for his needs to be met, and the giver does not have the financial capacity, he should give him according to his financial capacity. How much? The most desirable way of performing the mitzvah is to give 1/5 of one's financial resources. Giving 1/10 is an ordinary measure. Giving less than that reflects parsimony. A person should never refrain from giving less than 1/3 of a shekel a year. A person who gives less than this has not fulfilled the mitzvah. Even a poor person who derives his livelihood from charity is obligated to give charity to another person.
And this is, again, right out of the Talmud. What is the minimum amount and what's the maximum amount? In other words, they don't want people to impoverish themselves through the giving of tzedakah. So they set a floor of 10%, which is usual, and a ceiling of 20%. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that even poor people should give tzedakah. Why?
Well, here again, that's humility. You have pride if you give charity.
Exactly. In other words,
Still
it's
an
Do
obligation.
you have pride if you give charity?
no, it's
Well,
about
if you're
dignity.
receiving-
It's personal dignity.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
In other words, why should you say to somebody, you cannot fulfill this mitzvah? You're not allowed to fulfill this mitzvah because you're receiving charity. It's about the dignity of the poor. It's really quite fascinating. Even if they give a penny, they are required to give something. And they, yes, Cantor.
What's in between? So between the Torah and the Talmud and Maimonides, there's a lot of stages in.
Yeah, and I'll tell you the honest truth, I don't know about in Second
the Rif
Temporal.
or all these.
No. Well, what I'm saying is Maimonides really reflects the evolution of rabbinic law up to his time. What I don't know is between the biblical texts and the rabbinic texts, I honestly don't know about the literature regarding Jewish charity practices in the Second Temple period. There must have been something, but I'm really not don't know enough about that. Okay.
Because the Talmud has so much arguing, there's really no.
No, but that's the point. Everything that Maimonides is saying is coming out of rabbinic literature, and there's enough of it. A lot of the stuff is anecdotal. There's a lot of anecdotal stories about rabbis and how they gave tzedakah and how much they gave tzedakah, and all this eventually gets codified in the tradition, right? And so he's reflecting that evolution in his own day.
In general, did he become more strict or more open?
I think he was. You missed the part. He claimed that the tithing laws should be followed outside the land of Israel, which is extremely liberal and not accepted by anybody after that. All right, and again, we will see how he also, when he gets now. Notice he's all up in here. He's talking about individuals. One of the things that you find in rabbinic literature, of course, is what, for your Monopoly fans, the community chest. Okay? And that's already reflected in the Mishnah. So we already have what you would call communal charity institutions going back to early rabbinic times. And that continues right through. Again, there's a vast literature about Jewish communal service institutions and organizations during the Middle Ages and later. I mean, there really is a ton of material written by scholars on this, because up until the modern period, Jewish communities had to take care of their own social services. That was the norm in the Middle Ages. Each community took care of its own. And of course, giving the equivalent of tzedakah is part of one of the main pillars of Islam as well. So there were similar things going on in Muslim society that you will see that was going on in Jewish society in Maimonides' own day. All right, so let's read on number 6. Sam, you want to continue?
When a poor person whose identity is unknown says, "I am hungry, provide me with food," we do not investigate whether he is a deceiver. Instead, we provide him with sustenance immediately. If he was unclothed and he said, "Clothe me," we investigate whether he is a deceiver. If we are familiar with him, we clothe him according to his honor immediately, and we do not investigate the matter.
This is interesting. What happens if a person's a schnorrer, as we would say, right? Okay, a person who is a professional beggar or somebody who doesn't need the money, who's a deceiver. Notice there's a difference between money and clothing. I have no idea why, but the point is, if somebody comes and asks for money, we do not investigate him. And by the way, I had experience of this kind of issue when I was in, and almost all congregational rabbis do. Congregational rabbis often get people, Jews and non-Jews, coming to their door asking for money. And we all keep a certain amount of petty cash around. And the question is, are they schnorrers? Because there are people who go around and schnorr and are deceivers. And I remember years ago, there was one woman in particular who deceived a lot of my colleagues by phone about needing money for plane tickets to get some sick person back to Israel. It was a complete scam, okay? And what we often did in the communities where I live is we kept an informal schnorrers list. In other words, people who went around, who we know, who were like literally going around place to place, because our initial feeling was you don't question. If a person has to go to the embarrassing extent of coming to somebody to beg for money, you don't question, right? And that's the reason why if I, meet a beggar on the street, I always give them money. It's not up to me to judge. And I remember one particular instance that really struck this home to me in my first pulpit as an assistant rabbi in a large congregation in Toronto. I had a man come in, a Jewish man, probably about my age, probably about 30, 35 years old. And he was dressed kind of roughly, and he was incredible. I could tell how embarrassed he was. It was killing him to come in and ask for money. And he'd been a guy who'd grown up in exactly the same circumstances I had, middle class, upper middle class, went to college, became an accountant, and got caught embezzling and went to jail. Lost his job, lost his family, and he was out of jail, and he needed some money to tide him over before he started a construction job. That's what he told me. And And, maybe he was deceiving me, but if he was an incredible actor. And I looked at him and said, there, but for the grace of God go I, And it really struck home to me this issue of embarrassment and dignity and how important that is in dealing with people who are poor and asking for money. Most people do not do this, out of a sense of deception because it is horribly embarrassing. And when I think about today about how people who attack poor people as being lazy and all this kind of stuff, I am just infuriated by the lack of compassion and lack of understanding about the poor. It's just appalling, absolutely appalling. And our tradition is very strong on that issue. It is one of the most important issues in tzedakah, as you will see when you look at Maimonides' 8 grades of tzedakah, why anonymity is one of the highest levels, so that there is no chance for the giver to lord it over the person they're giving. Because when you give somebody money, you are still in a power imbalance, right? And that's one of the critical elements of tzedakah, which of course comes from the root meaning equity, is to reduce that power imbalance between the poor person and the other person. Robert, you had a comment.
It's almost a question. I remember Ed Koch when he was mayor saying, don't give to people that come up panhandling, because what you're going to be doing is enabling them to continue to purchase drugs. So the way I dealt with it personally was if someone came up to me on the street in Manhattan and they said they were hungry, could they have some money? I'd say, no, I will take you into that coffee store and I'll get you a cup of coffee and a donut. But I wouldn't give them money because I got this feeling I would be enabling them to do things which were destructive to them.
But you don't know that. That's the problem. I mean, I admire the fact you're willing to give them a meal, but the point is, and this is my own opinion, I am not going to presume to judge what they do with that money, because that to me is already keeping that power imbalance. I should be the one to tell them how to spend this money. It's none of my business. It's absolutely none of my business. Yeah.
What about the line that says, if he was unclothed and said, clothe me, we investigate?
Yeah, I don't understand why he says that, but evidently there is...
Well, that's simple. You can see.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. But the point is, maybe because of the value of the clothing, I have no idea.
But if you're familiar with him,
if you know him.
No, but if you don't know him, I mean, it's interesting that, like all things, there are limits. In other words, this is not an unlimited idea. And I tell you the truth, I mean, there were colleagues of mine who felt that we shouldn't have a schnorrer's list. If somebody's coming to beg, you should just give it to them, whatever. But if there's a certain point where you realize you really are being deceived, then, and as a rabbi having limited funds, you want to make sure that the people you give it to truly need it, rather than people who are going around deceiving people and about this. And I had lots of those. We had a real problem with that when I was in South Orange.
This speaks not of money, but it says to provide the hungry with food.
Yes.
Right.
And clothing for the unclothed. So it's not clear how we would come down on Robert's point.
Well, no, but this would include cash, and as you will see, help for the poor comes in a variety of different ways in Maimonides' own day. Again, cash, of course, is not widespread, so most of the aid given to the poor, in fact, is food, which, again, the most basic thing, but we're in a cash economy, so it's a very different kind of thing today. All right, Sam, you want to read one more?
Yes. 7, right? We provide sustenance and clothing for the poor of the Gentiles, together with the poor of the Jewish people, as an expression of the ways of peace. When a poor person begs from door to door, we do not give him a large gift. Instead, we give him a small gift. It is forbidden to turn away a poor person who asks for charity empty-handed. Even giving him 1 fig is sufficient, as Psalm 74 says, let not the dejected turn away in shame.
Okay, so notice the first part is important, and the phrase, the ways of peace, is a rabbinic phrase, mipnei darchei shalom. In other words, for societal peace, we do not exclude, and actually the term they actually use here is idolaters, because again, the rabbinic literature is dealing with the issue of pagans, that even a pagan poor we don't turn away for reasons of peace in the community. All right? The issue of this begging door to door is quite interesting because in Maimonides' own day, they were mostly dealing with the poor on a communal level rather than individually.
So they wouldn't be going door to door.
They would not encourage it. Were regular distributions to the poor by the community, as you will see from the community chest. So they obviously did not want to encourage people begging door to door, but that doesn't mean you're supposed to turn them away. All right?
A friend of mine who lives in Teaneck,
Yes.
who has lots of people come to the door, said she always gives something, but she has had people argue with her. Not enough. That's all you're giving me? It's not enough.
Right.
Yep.
How does she deal with that?
I don't remember. I don't know if she gave them more or not. She was very upset. Very
Did
upset.
she give them food or money?
Money.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Money.
that I've been in homes too where that has happened on a fairly continual basis, where people keep coming, same people keep coming, but that's not enough, and they come back.
In the same vein, when you hire somebody to do some work for you, always agree in advance on the price.
All right, Ed, you want to do number 9?
Yes.
When a poor person does not desire to take charity, we trick him and give it to him as a present or as a loan. When a rich man starves himself because he is miserly with his money, using it for neither food nor drink, we do not pay any attention.
But it's interesting is that our obligation to the poor goes to the point where we even have to help them even if they don't want it.
That was in Downton Abbey on Sunday.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was.
Where he tricked this man into taking money.
I don't watch Downton Abbey, so I
They pretended they had a loan that he was
What?
paying.
It is great.
Yeah, well, I was a big fan of Upstairs, Downstairs, and I've had enough of Upstairs, Downstairs, English 1930s class dramas. Okay, one more, Ed. When a
When
person,
a person does not want to give charity or desires to give less than what is appropriate for him, the court should compel him and give him stripes for rebellious conduct until he gives the amount it was estimated that he should give. We take possession of his property when he is present and expropriate the amount that is appropriate for him to give. We expropriate property for the sake of charity, even on Friday.
now what's interesting is they didn't do that in his own community. There was no kind of punishment or compelling. But in Christian Europe, the community actually had a lot more power to compel their members to pay their communal obligations, which were for a number of things. They were obviously to pay off the local ruler, that was really important, but also to provide for the community services. They had they were much stricter about that in Maimonides' own day. I don't think I didn't read of anywhere where in the actual time and place that Maimonides lived they did any of this. So this is again
The Jewish community?
the Jewish community. In other words, this is where Maimonides is reflecting sort of the ideal of the law, but not the reality of the community he lived in. Right? They didn't do that.
Stripes of corporal punishment?
Yeah, whip, lashes. All right. Ellie, do you want to read number 11?
It is forbidden to demand and to collect charity from a soft-hearted person who gives more than is appropriate to charity, or from a person who causes himself difficulty and gives to charity collectors so that he will not be embarrassed. When a charity collector subjected to
Embarrasses such a person.
and asks him for charity, the charity collector will be subjected to retribution in the future. As implied by Jeremiah, I will visit my providence on those who pressure me.
So, in other words, again, there are limits as to what you can do in terms of forcing it. In other words, There are people who, rather than appear to be, will just give you whatever you ask for, and he's saying you can't do that. And by the way, as you will see, the notion of the collector, the one in the community who actually does the collecting, is an important office. Okay, and here the term is gabaim. Okay, the gabais is the term used here in the Hebrew. That's the term used for the collection. Okay, and there were, as you will see, people who were appointed to do that collection. There was a whole, in his own day, again, in different communities at different times, there were different kinds of structures, but in his day, there was a whole administration of this stuff. And it was fairly sophisticated and complex
So this is really
organization.
institutionalized.
Yes,
And people aren't doing it so much out of the goodness of their heart.
they should.
Yes, they should. We should all pay taxes out of the goodness of
Right.
our heart. There are those among us who hold back.
Exactly. In other words, you have to look at this when you're getting to the communal level as a form of communal taxation. As you will see, it was used for a variety of things, not just direct aid to the poor, but it was essential for the health of the community. All right, Ellie, read number 13.
A poor person who is one's relative receives priority over all others. The poor of one's household receives priority over the poor of one's city. And the poor of one's city receive priority over the poor of another city. You shall surely open your hand to your brother, the poor, and the destitute in your land.
In other words, there is a priority, and the old saying is charity begins at home. In other words, your first obligation is to your family, and then it's to your local community, right, before anybody else. Now, this is important because in Maimonides' own day, Cairo, because it was often a center of refugees from Jews from the Maghreb and other places, often had people, Jews from other countries, coming in, and often destitute, and because the community was such an important economic hub, often received requests for support from poorer communities like Jerusalem. Okay, so this was a very important issue about sending money to other communities or support scholars or schools or all this kinds of things. And first and foremost was your family and then your local community. That's really interesting.
Wasn't the original had the Torah quotes, or it's later editing? I think it's later editing, no?
No, the Torah quotes are here. When Maimonides quotes the Torah,
But he says where it's
yeah,
from.
yeah, exactly, yeah, absolutely.
Because I have an app that doesn't have it.
He has he quotes the pasuk, but he doesn't tell you what the pasuk is. He just assumes you're going to know what it is.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So,
yeah, no, he doesn't put in brackets because he just assumes you're going to
So
know where
that's
it's
a later-
from.
that's a later-
Absolutely.
So I don't understand.
Well, for example, what it says, as it is said, he quotes Deuteronomy 15:11 in the text. He doesn't put Deuteronomy 15:11.
He just says as it says.
Yeah.
He just says as it says,
So
and
you're going to know.
you're going to know what that verse is, where that verse is from. Okay, if you're educated enough to read the Mishnah Torah, you know the verses from the Torah. Okay.
Well, but this one says as implied by.
Well,
That's
he,
obviously.
let me see which is
You-
number.
Oh, it says
number-
Shene'emar, that's all.
She says Shenamar as it is said. Okay. Usually they didn't. This translation doesn't, but there's always in Hebrew the equivalent of quotation marks.
Got it.
There are no quotation marks, so they'll say Shene'emar as was said, or Kakatuv as it is written, right? Something like that. And then you know he's quoting a scriptural verse. And if you're educated enough to read this, you know the Tanakh virtually by heart. Remember, Maimonides' goal in the Mishnah Torah was all you needed to do was to study the Tanakh and study the Mishnah Torah, and that's all you needed to know, for Jewish law. All right? Let's go to the next one, chapter 8, where he's now going to talk a little bit about more the communal aspect of it. Paul, do you want to read Halakha 1, charity is considered a vow?
Charity is considered a vow. Therefore, one who says, I pledge to give
A sela, sorry for the space. to charity.
to charity, or I will give the seller to charity is obligated to give to charity immediately. If he delays his transgressions, the commandment against delaying the observation of one's vow, for he has the capacity to make the gift immediately, and generally there are poor people at hand.
Let's stop there for a second. So, in other words, when you make a pledge, here you're getting into the law of vows. Okay? And a neder. And there are legal obligations. There's a whole host of legal obligations about vows. Okay? So, when you make a pledge, you are absolutely required to give it. And notice, if he doesn't, he's not merely transgressing against giving the charity, he's transgressing the law against not living up to your vow, which is quite serious.
Yes, but let no one say you shouldn't get the pledge card signed.
Well, as you will see, there in fact was the issue of, you're going to find some things when we get to the material on his community that sound very familiar. I'm quite serious about it. And the more I was reading about it, the more I was like, what?
Well, anyway,
Like, when were most of the pledges collected? On the high holidays. Seriously.
Because people are there on the high holiday.
Well, it's not that people were there. That's the time people took these things most seriously, because they were repenting, and tzedakah was an important part of repentance. Anyway, read on, Paul. So, in other words, he says there are usually poor people at hand, so you've got to immediately, fulfill it. Go on. If there are no poor...
If there are no poor people at hand, he should set aside and put away until he finds poor people. If he made a stipulation that he is not obligated to make the donation until he finds poor people, he does not have to separate it until the poor are at hand. Similarly, if he made a stipulation at the time he made his vow to charity or pledged his donation to that the trustees of the charitable fund could exchange it for gold, as they are permitted to do so.
Okay, so that's the point, right? In other words, there could be stipulations made in the vow. I vow so much money when I see a poor person, right? In other words, you have to fulfill what exactly you say in the vow, right? And so on and so forth. And notice the trustees of the charitable fund, because that's what you have. He's reflecting general rabbinic law here. Okay. Robert, you want to read the next one?
If the poor would benefit from the delay of the money in the possession of the charity collector so that he could motivate others to give, the charity collector may borrow the money and pay when funds are required. For charity does not resemble funds dedicated to the temple treasury, from which it is forbidden to benefit.
In other words, you can't borrow from the temple treasury, but you can borrow the money and then pay immediately out, and the idea is that the loan will get repaid when the pledges come in. Okay? Read on.
It is forbidden for a Jew to receive charity from an idolater in public. He is
Yeah, that's actually what the term used here, yeah.
If he is unable to subsist on the charity given by Jews, and it is impossible to receive charity from the idolater in private, it is permitted. And it is possible, no, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. And it is impossible to receive charity from the idolater in private, it is permitted.
Okay, in other words, you're not supposed to publicly receive money from an idolater, But if you cannot subsist on the money given to you by Jews, and it's impossible to receive charity from the Gentiles in private, you can accept it in public. Read on.
When an idolater king or official sends money to the Jews for charity, we do not return it to him so as to not jeopardize peaceful relationships with the king. Instead, we take the charity from him and give it to the idolatry poor in secret, so that the king will not hear.
Okay?
Schmacht.
Yes. In other words, again, why are funds from idolaters not permitted? Because they may have come about as a result of idolatrous worship, and anything connected with idolatrous worship is forbidden. But again, mipnei darchei shalom, mipnei, and for survival of your community, if the king gives you a donation, you'd better not refuse it. Right?
But you have to give it to another source.
Because you're not allowed to benefit from idolatry. That's the point. In any way whatsoever. Now again, this law didn't really apply in Maimonides' day. Because the Muslims weren't idolaters in his definition. Okay? Christians, he wasn't so sure of.
How about secular Jews in Israel? They take very willingly.
That's a situation he probably didn't conceive of. Now, what's interesting is that part of the issue of tzedakah is the issue of what's called redemption of captives. And this was a very serious problem in the Middle Ages, where because of war, this is where it usually happened, people would be captured in war and held for ransom. In fact, this was a very common thing on battlefields, for example, in the 100 Years' War, where you didn't want to kill a noble knight, you wanted to capture him alive to hold him for ransom because that was a good way to make money. In fact, after the Battle of Poitiers, the King of France was captured by the English and taken to London and held until an enormous ransom was collected for him. And this is one of the ways that people, rulers often made money. And other people would capture people and hold them for ransom, usually because of warfare, but sometimes through kidnapping. And of course, we see this happens this very day in certain countries. So
happens in Israel. They exchange 1,000 Palestinians for one Israeli soldier.
And so there is this long, important tradition of what's called pidyon
But they didn't
shvuim.
capture them in order to get money for them.
Well, they're for other reasons, but nonetheless, pidyon shvuim, the redemption of the captives, is an extremely important Jewish value. And you find in the Geniza, for example, documents of people who had been redeemed by the community who then went around trying to collect money to repay what the community paid for their ransom. Okay, this is where they would have a letter from the community saying this person was a captive, so much money, therefore he's asked. This is, in other words, a legitimate certificate for him to go around. And they often went from community to community looking for this money. But
redeem a captive.
to pay back their own redemption. Okay. Or the community would have special campaigns to raise money for captives from other countries. They get written from places we've lost. One of the most interesting series of documents on this from a later period is from the Polish Jewish Community Council called the Council of the Four Lands in the I think it started in the 17th century. In the 17th and 18th century, maybe as early as the 16th, I can't remember offhand, the Polish community had a giant super organization called the Council of the Four Lands. In other words, the kingdom or empire of Poland and Lithuania was divided into 4 provinces, and each one of them had a Jewish council, but then there was you might call it like the version of a federation, but they had a super federation, so to speak, that covered all of the things, and many of their minutes of their meetings survive. And the Council of the Four Land negotiated directly with the Polish crown.
1520 to 1764.
There you go. In 1764, the council went bankrupt because they had been squeezed so much for money. They were in effect borrowing money to pay their expenses, and they were not collecting enough funds, so they ended up going bankrupt. But we have minutes from the Lithuanian Council. We have a number of minutes from the overall council that have survived. they're fascinating reading what they pay for, because they're covering the whole range of communal service, including the hiring of rabbis and shochtim and mohalim and scribes, and paying for orphan brides to have dowries. And one of the big expenses in the 17th century was the redemption of captives because of the Chalniki massacres that occurred, right? Where there was this huge anti-Semitic attacks by Slavs against, there was a big war by Slavs against the Poles, and there were estimated as many as 300,000 Jews were killed, but a lot of them were refugees, and there were also a lot who were captured and held captive, and the Council of the Four Lands had to deal with this. It was a serious social issue and cost them a lot of money. So this is something that has been going on for a very, very long time, and was a big issue in Maimonides' own day, for example. Like when the Crusaders captured a town in Eretz Yisrael, they would hold the Jews for ransom, and the Jews of Egypt would help pay off the ransom. Okay? Read on.
The redemption of captives receives priority over sustaining the poor and providing them with clothing. Indeed, there is no greater mitzvah than the redemption of captives. For a captive is amongst those who are hungry, thirsty, and unclothed, and he is in mortal peril. If someone pays no attention to his redemption, he violates the negative commandments. Do not harden your heart or close your hand. Do not stand by when the blood of your neighbor is in danger, and he shall not oppress him with exhausting work in your presence. And he has negated the observation of the positive commandment. You shall open up your hand to him. Your brother shall live with you. Love your neighbor as yourself. Save those who are taken for death, and many other decrees of this nature. There is no mitzvah as great as the redemption of captives.
So you can see how big of a problem it was, that he really pushes all of the Torah things, even quotes a book of Proverbs, and he says there's no greater mitzvah because it's like pikuach nefesh, it's like saving a life, right? There was an interesting case in the 13th century in Germany where Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, the greatest halachic authority in the 13th century in Germany, decided he really wanted to get the heck out of the kingdom he was in because it was so bad, and he was captured on the way, and he was held for ransom. And because he was such a great scholar, the king was really trying to squeeze a lot of money out of the Jewish community. He said to the community, "You are not allowed to ransom me, because if you do, he's going to do that to other Talmudic great rabbis." So he refused to allow the community to redeem him. He died in jail, and the community, the king held his bones in ransom for a number of years until a wealthy Jew paid the ransom for his remains, and then had him buried in a grave, and when he died, was buried beside him. And if you go to the Israel Museum, you will see facsimiles of the tombstone of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg and the guy who redeemed his body. It was a horrible situation because he was right. If they paid the ransom, well, it's the precedent today. One, you don't want to negotiate when a terrorist is holding somebody hostage, because then they'll keep doing it. But then there comes a point where you have to say, what are you going to do? This was the whole thing with Gilad Shalit, right? So it was a very serious problem. It's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
So it also brings you back to Robert's question half an hour ago.
Yeah.
It's not only a question of what are you going to do with the money if I give it to you.
Yes.
It's a question of enabling.
Yes. Yeah, but in this case, you're dealing with not just, a person who wants a meal. You're dealing with somebody whose life is really, really threatened, right? The implication being if the ransom's not paid, they're going to kill him.
You see, Rabbi, someone made the decision to bury the man next to the rabbi who had said, "Do not redeem me."
Right.
So I could point out that the man who redeemed him had violated an instruction, and maybe he didn't deserve to be buried next to him.
Well,
because he was enabling exactly what the rabbi had said you should not do.
Well, the community was so appalled by all of this that they went along with it. appalled by the fact that the king kept the guy's body with the unburied body.
I understand the dilemma.
I know.
But,
Just want to have a
you're
good
the nice
conversation,
guy
you
and
know?
I'm the hard guy.
Okay. Take a look at chapter. Now we're looking at chapter 9. Chapter 9 deals with the communal institutions. George, you want to pick it up there?
Where, I'm not sure.
On page 4, in every
I'm
city.
sorry, yeah, I see it. In every city where Jews live, they are obligated to appoint faithful men of renown as trustees of a charitable fund. They should circulate among the people from Friday to Friday and take from each person what is appropriate for him to give and the assessment made upon him. They then allocate the money from Friday to Friday, giving each poor person sufficient food for 7 days. This is called the kupa.
That's the point. Generally, in the Talmud, it's called the kupa. In some cases, it's there are some other terms, but in most places, it was called the kupa. Interestingly enough, it wasn't called that in Maimonides' hometown. It was called the kodesh.
So these men, the kupa, are both
The
collectors
gabaim.
and they're both collectors and donors.
They're collectors and they distribute,
Distributors.
but they're not the administrators, as you will see. I mean, in his own community, there were administrators over the collectors. Okay, so yeah, and this was, by the way, generally speaking, what they did. They usually collected on Fridays, but in fact, as you will see, they didn't always stick to this. They often did it a couple of times a week, and there was more than one kind of donation that was given. All right, read number 2.
Similarly, we appoint trustees who take bread, different types of food, fruit, or money from every courtyard, from those who make a spontaneous donation, and divide what was collected among the poor in the evening, giving each poor person sustenance for that day. This is called
Tamchui.
tamchui.
Okay, so notice the first is cash, the second is food, and was important. There's more than one form of donation, right?
This is used in conversational Hebrew too.
Exactly, even
What is
today.
tamchui?
Tamchui.
Yeah,
And how's it used?
It's like a soup kitchen.
right.
Oh,
And it literally means a dish.
but it's used as in
That
soup.
word.
Exactly. It's not a soup kitchen. What it is collecting food and distributing food.
In Hebrew, it's a beit timchui, like a place where people
Yeah,
can get.
exactly.
Got it.
Read the next one, which is quite
We
fascinating.
have never seen or heard of a Jewish community that does not have a kupa for a charity. A tamchui, by contrast, exists in some communities but not in others. The common practice at present is that the trustees of the kupa circulate among the community and collect every day and divide the proceeds every Friday.
Okay, so and he's reflecting mostly his own time here. Let me read the last one.
When a person has lived in a city for 30 days, we compel him to give charity to the kupa together with the inhabitants of the city. If he dwelled there for 3 months, we compel him to contribute to the tamchui. If he dwelled there for 6 months, we compel him to contribute to the fund used to clothe the poor of the city. If he dwelled there for 9 months, we compel him to contribute to the fund used for the burial of the poor of the city and the provision of all their burial.
In other words, the more he becomes a permanent resident, the more he becomes part. And notice the different funds, right? There's the kupa, there's the tamchui, there's the clothing fund, and there's the burial fund. Okay?
It's interesting that they're segregated funds.
They are segregated funds. And so take a look on number 7. This material that I've given you here is taken from Goitein's work, The Mediterranean Society, from the Cairo Geniza, in his second volume on the community. And there's a whole section on, the whole section's about the community. We talked about cantors at one point. He has a section on community officials. He has a whole section, about 30 or 40 pages, on community services and how they're run. And at the back, he has lists of documents that deal, he doesn't give you all the documents, but he describes each one of them, dozens and dozens of documents over several hundred years that talk about lists of people they have gotten money from and the amounts they gave, lists of beneficiaries. It's amazing. There's more material in the Cairo Geniza about the community services than you find anywhere else in the Middle Ages. So this is the stuff from the period around the time of Maimonides lived. Okay? First of all, in his own communities, they use the term kodesh to refer to communal assets and property. And it was used instead of the word kupah. Kupah was the more common one, even in other communities in Egypt. The pasika was pledges made by individuals or the community as a whole for certain purposes. And then there was an Arabic term. Jibaya was the collection of the sums promised. So these are the terms that are used. There were two kinds of officials. The parnas or the parnasim, who were the administrators or a board of administrators. And then there were the collectors, who also act as the paymasters, and Maimonides uses the term gabai. Okay, so where did they get their money from? This is quite fascinating. The biggest amount of money they got was rent from houses and property owned by the community, which were usually given as charitable trusts by individuals in their wills. In other words, by the way, this was very common in the Muslim community as well. People in their wills would will property to the community as a charitable trust, often with certain stipulations as to how the money was to be spent, as we will see. But this was in Maimonides' own day, in the town of Fustat, the old Cairo, that was the biggest source of revenue for the community, interestingly enough. Okay, number two, they taxed meat at the slaughterhouses, the shochtim, because who bought the most meat? The wealthier members of the community. So it was a consumption tax. Okay, number three, fines from failure to complete contracts collected by the courts. In other words, contracts often had stipulations. If I don't pay back this loan, or I don't do this work, say a workman or a craftsman, by a certain period of time, I will pay X amount of whatever to the community chest as a fine.
To the community chest?
Yes, to the community chest. Okay, so that was often a source of funds. Then there were special appeals, pledges for the year often made during or close after the high holidays. Pledges usually collected weekly by collectors. In other words, you pledged for the year, and then once or twice a week, the collectors would come and take your weekly part of your yearly pledge. One of the most important ones was the appeal for wheat that was given to the poor to grind into bread. And then there were cash bequests. Okay, who got the money? There was a semi-weekly distribution of bread to the poor. There were clothing distributions, usually twice a year or so. There were special loans and cash requests from individuals. Now, Jews in Muslim countries were required to pay a poll tax. This was part of Muslim law, that non-Muslims had to pay a yearly poll tax. Now, that sounds pretty awful, but in fact, the poll tax for hundreds of years was relatively stable. It didn't really grow that much. And as a result, Jews in Muslim lands knew how much their taxes were. And as a result, it facilitated economic development because the local rulers didn't capriciously all of a sudden impose all kinds of new taxes on them. Now, that did happen sometimes, but not that often. In Europe, there was no tradition of a regular poll tax, so the rulers could squeeze whatever they could get out of the Jewish community, which made things a heck of a lot more difficult. In fact, we even have a letter from a Jewish merchant who moved to a Muslim country because it was a lot better for business, because he knew what his taxes were going to be. Whereas in Europe, he could be extorted all kinds of money. Okay, so poll taxes were sometimes paid by the community for poor people who couldn't afford to pay the poll tax. Or they were, actually that's E. The poll tax in D was often for community officials or scholars. Salaries of scholars and officials, children's education of community officials. So in other words, people who were community officials or poor scholars were supported by the community. The poor's poll taxes were often paid, free lodging for the poor in some of these community properties. Usually they rented out the properties. Medical care for the poor was paid for. Education for children in general was paid for. Burial expenses, aid to travelers, and the ransoming of captives. So this is where the money went. It's a full range of social services. There was a scholar who tried to create, and again, this is quoted in Goitein years ago as part of his PhD thesis, the estimated yearly budget of the community of Fustat based on the Cairo Geniza between 1180 and 1195. That's right around the time. That's right at the time Maimonides was there and was one of the leading people in the community. And notice what it said, how it goes. It's quite fascinating. That when you take into account administration and taxes and cleaning and so on for the properties, this is for the religious endowments of the properties that were donated to the community. A full 40% of the income was spent on, paying for the administration basically and the upkeep. Okay, 45% was usually given to scholars and officials as salaries. Synagogues, big problem for synagogues was paying for oil, for lighting. That was expensive. Charity, mainly individual cases, 6%.
Not a lot out of it.
No, so...
That's fascinating, small amount.
Well, but don't forget, there was a lot of other money collected from other sources that was given to the poor, but the specific charitable, the religious endowments, or what they call the pious requests, were used for these purposes. Now, here's an example of one that was found in the Cairo Geniza. This is quoted in Norman Stillman's book, The Jews of Arab Lands, which is a wonderful book, which has both a history and a source book, and he covers the entire period from the beginning of Islam until the modern period. What are you pointing out?
6.1,
I think that's a shudder.
Yeah, but don't forget they had a lot of other funds for charity cases. Okay.
Is this separate from the food and
Yeah.
clothing?
No. This is just for the properties. Remember, this is just for the religious endowments. This is not for the meat taxes and all that stuff. This is just for the property.
I would never contribute to a charity that had that kind.
No. But this is not the one you contributed. This is the one that people left properties in their wills.
As a charity.
All right, yeah, okay. Well, listen,
I was employed by the federal government.
Yes.
Every year you got a list where you could have a standard deduction taken out of your salary. And one of the things that they did, for whatever you like, it was a book. And at the beginning of the year, you flipped through the book and you chose what you wanted. And they told you what percentage in a given charity went for administration and what percent was distributed. And that's how I would decide where I went.
I understand that, but I'm not talking about modern times. Look, don't forget, this is the upkeep of the property, and which would cost a lot of money to keep these properties up, right?
So it looks like a lot of money.
Well, all I'm saying is, in those days, maybe this is completely legitimate. All right, let's take a look. The beginning of the document is missing, so it starts right in this part, and it's a report, an internal report for the community, as you will see. Would somebody like to? All right, Irma, you want to read the poor of the two aforesaid communities?
The poor of the two aforesaid communities, the Rabbinites and the Karaites.
This is interesting that the Rabbinite community and the Karaite community often shared communal charity administrations. Okay, go on.
The Rabbinites,
The rabbinic Jews and the Karaites that didn't follow rabbinic. I mean, yeah.
with regard to what has been previously mentioned, is under the supervision of the Jewish court or of such person as it sees fit to delegate. It is an everlasting pious foundation.
That was what they usually called them, pious foundations.
An eternal mort main.
That's a legal term, mort main, meaning money to be used.
Holding, I think.
A holding for a holding for the poor.
For the benefit of the said poor. It is an inalienable charitable trust which may not be terminated ever.
And then I didn't list them, but they list all the people who are the witnesses to this, okay? And they're all prominent people in the community. Go on, with regard.
With regard to the compound known as the House of the She-Camel.
This is a compound of buildings, okay, that was owned by a guy.
One half of it is to be dedicated to the communal trust.
Hebrew lehekdesh. Interestingly enough, hekdesh is a term a legal term in Hebrew, meaning if you declare something hekdesh, it's no longer your property, and it's kind of like open to whoever wants to take it. Like when you put your garbage can out in the front of your, if somebody comes along and starts rummaging through your garbage, you can't say to them, that's my property, because by putting it out there, in effect, you've said, it's hekdesh, right? So it's fascinating. They use this as the term for the communal trust. Go on. 1 quarter.
1 quarter is already a pious foundation for Sit al-Al, the daughter of Fadl al-Kohen ben al-Sheikh Sheikh Abu Lakaram ben Saddam.
That's his full Arabic name, by the way. So notice, 1/2 is dedicated to the communal trust. This is the income from this compound of buildings. 1 quarter is given for this daughter of the guy. Fadl al-Kohen is the guy who's giving it, by the way. Okay, go on.
In what language?
This is all written in Arabic originally.
So why would they keep it? I mean, I thought they kept only the Hebrew.
They kept, no, they kept anything written in Hebrew letters. This was written in Hebrew letters, but it was in Arabic. Go on.
From her father's money by a will, which stipulates that if anything was left from the rent after repairs, 2 dirhams from this would be paid to her sister, Sadyat, the wife of Hiba ben Abi Ghalib al-Sagi, every month for as long as she lives. Of the shrouds for the dead, or on the poll tax of a scholar with no outside income, but on nothing else.
Okay, so these are things, this is what it's supposed to be for. Go on, read on.
This then is the text of the will, word for word, with the names of those who appear as witnesses, and the names of the 2 judges who presided over them at the validation. They were known as people who fear God. May he be exalted.
Now, so they have just, this is a report. So they've now just reported what the will was and the witnesses. Again, this is an internal report for the community, as you will see why, because this is a rather interesting little piece of communal history here. Go on.
Therefore, after having read this will, which was made by the owner of the property himself, in accordance with the laws of Israel, we adhered to it and made the compound a regular charitable trust for the benefit of the poor. For our sages, peace be upon them, have said it is a religious obligation to fulfill the words of the deceased.
And it's a quote from the Talmud.
Thus it was not a whim on the part of the elder Abu Farik ben Kusa to write as he did in the document of declarations, since he was, may God have mercy upon him, a God-fearing man who performed charitable deeds, and who was philanthropic to the poor and to the students of the Torah. It only appears from the case that this money was deposited with him by our master, the Ma'ula, the excellent.
Probably a judge named Nathan ben Solomon HaKohen.
May his memory be blessed, until some property would become available to be purchased as a charitable trust with it. Then the monk,
who was a Coptic minister of the Fatimid Caliph, who in 1126 began a confiscation of Jewish property and then 3 years later was executed.
Until he came into office, may his bones ground to dust. Now, since the date of the written declaration is 1127.
And it was in the Hebrew, it was actually in the Muslim date, but I put it into the Christian calendar.
The very year they were confiscating people's property, he, Abdullah Faraj, deemed it proper that this money should be spent in acquiring that half of the house of the she-camel for the benefit of the poor. No doubt he came to this decision after consulting with our master, the Ma'ula, may his memory be blessed. Then he went to a scribe and insisted that he should insert into the written document that this money had been received by him from Ibn.
And it's a blank, there's a hole there in the document.
And that he directed him to spend it on behalf of the Jewish poor. The scribe wrote as he was requested, though he was not very attentive to the phrasing as he wrote, since the desired intent, namely that it was to be acquired for the poor, has already been achieved. This was a most sensible decision, because this way he was safe from the monk hearing that he had money deposited with him for the Jewish poor with which to purchase property on their behalf. For he would surely send someone to seize it from him, just as he seized the 300 dinars that were deposited with the Meula, may his memory be blessed, for Ibn Shuway.
Okay, so in other words, what's going on here? In order to protect the 300 dinars deposited with him from confiscation, Abul Faraj had a document altered to show that the money had been spent to purchase half a compound in his neighborhood pious foundation. The compound in reality already belonged to the communal trust. The report translated here was probably made for the community's private records to keep the matter straight. In other words, the compound of the she-camel was already owned by the community as a charitable trust. Now, Abu Faraj was a well-known philanthropist who was trying to avoid having his money stolen by the monk. So he had a document altered to say he paid for half of the compound, so he didn't have the money, right? And the community created this internal report just to keep matters straight, so they would remember what was going on. And of course, it was considered legitimate to do this because they felt the confiscations of this guy were illegal, right? So any way you could hide them is all right. But you notice here, you learn here not only, what was going on at the time, and this, of course, is decades before, this is before Maimonides was born, actually. So this is like earlier on in the century, before the Maimonides family got to Fustat. But it was the same, what was going on there. But you notice the important thing is that what happens with the kind of charitable trust when we're talking about properties. So this pious guy buys half, has this compound, and half of the rents is given to the community for various charitable purposes, and 1/4 is given to his daughter, and if there's any leftover money, it's given to her sister, and so on and so forth. So this just kind of gives you some of the complexities of what is going on in the whole charitable system that existed during the time of Maimonides. We actually don't find a lot of documents about this stuff with his name on it, although there are some, but there's a lot from his son, who took over as head of the community when Maimonides died. So there's a number of documents dealing with contributions with his son's name on it, referred to as the Nagid, and the Nagid Abraham. And often the Nagid is listed as one of the contributors, and you find documents about this not only from Abraham, but from his son and his grandson, who took over, who were heads of the community after him. So the Maimonides family was heavily involved in this kind of stuff from the documentation that's survived. Yeah,
So
Sam?
what was this internal change? Were they trying to protect somebody
Yeah.
from having done something which was not quite right?
Well, it was an attempt to hide funds from illegal confiscation.
Oh.
And they were, what they considered illegal confiscation by this guy they didn't like, this Coptic minister, who, I don't know the whole story. I mean, maybe he was stealing this stuff and keeping it to himself, but the point is that they were trying to keep it straight, so they knew exactly where various monies had come from and where it had gone and so on and so forth. So this guy who hid this money with them through this ruse was a well-known philanthropist, and so they were obviously wanted to help him out, right? Yes, Robert?
You will not be surprised, Rabbi, to find I completely disagree with this analysis. I think that what we are seeing here is just another way of filching community funds for yourself. One of the things you always have to be concerned about is when you have fraudulent charities. And what you have is a straw man here. If you look at the second paragraph from the bottom, if you look at the second line from the bottom, it says, "For he would surely send someone to seize it." In other words, there is going to be a problem, so I'm going to hide funds in a way that you won't be able to trace him. What he's doing is he's hiding community money, and he's putting it in his own pocket.
No, he's not. On the contrary, he's hiding his own money. No, you're mistaken. He's hiding his own money in the guise of a contribution to the community through an important scholar's help, And notice at the beginning of it, they said all these people, they attest to this man's virtues and honesty and piety. He's doing it, and this is a guy who has been a major philanthropist to the community. So they're helping him hide funds, not that has already been given. It has not been given to the community. The charitable foundation was given by somebody else, and that money is protected.
But is this money ultimately intended for charity, or is it that he is just sheltering his money?
I can't say 100%, but my guess is that he probably would have ended up giving it to the community, given what they say about him, but I can't say that for sure. The point is they're helping to protect the philanthropist from what they consider illegal confiscation of money. This is not money that he's taking from the community. It's his own money.
If I gave him money for his organization,
I'm not talking about modern law. I'm talking about the Middle Ages here.
And he looked me in the eye and said, Robert, 6.1% is going to go to the people that you're giving the money for. He wouldn't get
No,
it.
again, no, you're mistaking the budget. You're mistaking the
You
budget.
lived in a hostile environment and somebody threatened you that they're going to take your money.
You're also
You're hiding it to order to give it to your.
You're also misunderstanding what the purpose of this charitable endowment. This is not a cash. These are not the other taxes and stuff. These are the properties that have been given to the community from which rents are given. So you own a property. The most important thing you need to do with a property is to make sure it doesn't fall into disrepair.
I left my house to the community for charity.
Yes.
And I found that 6% of the
Yeah, sorry, 45% are going to scholars and officials. That was considered a major part of the community's charitable giving, was to support scholars and local community officials like the shochtim and the cantors and the mohalim and the teachers. It paid the salaries of community officials. It's not all the money of the community went to the poor. They needed it for running the community in general. I think you're really, and giving money for lighting in the synagogue, that was a critical.
Somebody likes to do.
No, but you're completely mistaking. There was plenty of other money that was given to the poor. Just these particular kinds of endowments were not used primarily to give to the poor. They were used for other
I mean,
things.
it's pretty amazing that they're so organized.
Exactly. That's the point. Yes,
I
Sam.
have a question about the date.
Yeah.
1127, you said you changed it from the Muslim.
Yes.
Does the Muslim calendar start with the birth of Muhammad?
No, it starts, I believe, with the Hajj, which or the move from Mecca. What is it called? The Hijra, when he, so it's 5 something or other in the Muslim calendar, I forget.
You get someone like Carnegie who leaves money in an endowment, and you look at the way that people who run the endowment live off the fat of the land.
You're applying modern standards to medieval
No.
times.
I have documentary proof from the Cairo Ghanese.
So you think it was wrong for the community to pay for the salaries of court officials from these endowments? That's what they were given for. That's what the will. Look at the guy's will. He gave it for the support of scholars. So what's wrong with that? Tell me. Nothing. That was the whole point.
What's the Hajjara?
Hajjara is when Muhammad moved from one place to another, and that was considered the official date of the Muslim year, beginning of the Muslim year.
What's fascinating about this whole thing is this thing that was kept secret, and they just had this internal document to keep